Hi everyone, and welcome to the Risk Awareness Week. My name is Alex Sidorenko, and I am Head of Operational Investment, Risk and Insurance at one of the world's largest fertilizer company and one of the biggest coal companies in Russia. So today I wanted to talk about environmental risks and using quantitative risk analysis techniques to improve environmental decision making. And I wanted to start with a little caveat. I am not thinking or saying that climate change is not important. In fact, it clearly is, because we have the whole second day of the Risk Awareness Week this year dedicated to climate risk management and using quantitative techniques in the context of climate change. But I wanted to take this small opportunity to talk a little bit about not the long-term implications, not the risks in the next 6, 12, or 10 years' time. I wanted to talk about environmental risks that are harming our environment and our flora and fauna today, yesterday, and tomorrow. And the topic of my conversation, specifically as the pilot, I'm going to use water pollution because there's water pollution, there's air pollution, and waste. At least this is how the legislation in Russia is set up. There are specific types of pollutions. And I chose water pollution as just an example to demonstrate the technique. In fact, you can apply the same technique, the same mathematics to any type of pollution. And why I feel it is an important area to discuss, and why I wanted to share with everyone who's attending Risk Awareness Week. And by the way, make this interactive, ask questions underneath this video, and I will try to respond to them. So I wanted to take pollution, and specifically water pollution, for one specific reason. What I have observed as the head of risk in the corporation is that people responsible for environmental risks, our HSE teams, ECG teams, our environmental teams, they're quite often struggling to communicate and speak the same language as the shareholders, because the risks that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis are very real, very damaging for the environment, and quite costly. But not as costly as some of the market or foreign exchange, some of the price risk or some of the foreign exchange risk, or even large construction risks. So the voices of environmental stuff is just dulled down by all the other conversations around different risks in at least the minds of the shareholders. And yet, these risks, these environmental risks, are very, very important, and I wanted to give them kind of the right tools and the techniques to be heard. And in order to be heard, in order for them to be heard, they need to speak the language of business, the language of decision makers, the language of money, either missed opportunities or the costs through fines and additional environmental payments. So first observation is environmental teams quite often find it difficult to communicate and justify why a new water purification facility, for example, that costs tens and tens of millions of dollars needs to be constructed to reduce some risk exposure. So they find it difficult to communicate the risk exposure, and they find it quite difficult to justify the budgets, the expenses, the capex and additional opex necessary for dealing with environmental risks. So that's number one. And the second observation I've made, which was completely bizarre, is that whenever environmental teams try to quantify pollution risks, for example water pollution risks, they always underestimate the true risk exposure, which I just found bizarre, because literally at the same time, when internal auditors are trying to quantify the environmental risks, they always overestimate the risk exposure. So that situation doesn't really help us much because on one side, the executives hear people underestimating. On the other side, auditors are usually overestimating by selecting unrealistic, catastrophic scenarios and just talking about that. So that doesn't really instill trust in the decision makers' pardon, brain. So we came up with something a little bit more subtle. We came up with a stochastic calculator that allows the business to have a fair representation of what the real risk exposure is. And I'm going to talk about two things here. Thing number one, environmental risks are quite complex matters. In fact, that they're so complex that the easiest or the only proper way to represent the true nature of the environmental risk profile is through a decision tree. Because every single environmental risk, including water pollution, always has a number of consequences, and I'm going to talk about those consequences in a second. But not only it has a number of branches, a number of consequences, most of those consequences are not set in stone. The legislation usually prescribes some sort of ranges. And so what do you do when you have multiple consequences, all possible either independently or with some sort of relationship, some sort of correlation between them, and each of those consequences has an uncertain range of possible outcomes? Well, as any good risk manager will tell you, that's the perfect situation for using a stochastic decision tree. And that's in fact what we've done. So here's a quick snapshot of what we had to do for the water pollution. For water pollution, the consequences, and again, this will depend highly on the local legislation in your country, but my guess is it's going to be pretty similar in the general idea. And the consequences for water pollution break down into two different buckets. There is one bucket which is fines and additional payments to the government. And that specifically in Russia, that includes administrative fines that are actually not that expensive. That includes additional payments for the damage to the environment, and those can be very, very expensive depending on the concentrations. And for each of those consequences, there's usually a methodology by the Ministry of Environment or some other legislation that literally prescribes how you calculate those additional payments, which makes our job as risk managers a little bit easier. We just plug in all those formulas in. The numbers are not in the formulas, are still ranges, so we have to use Monte-Carlo to multiply ranges together, but at least there's some guidance on how to calculate consequences for a particular type. So there's one bucket with kind of legal consequences, fines, and there's also a probability of criminal prosecution as well. So that's one of the consequences, and that's in the first bucket. Everything kind of legally binding, where the company will have to pay for the pollution and the damage caused. But then there's the second bucket, which is business implications. And for example, in Russia, one of the interesting things that the legislation says that if the company is found to be polluting the environment above the approved limits that have been set for that company, the inspectors have the opportunity and the possibility of stopping the production for up to 90 days. And this is again very interesting. It says up to 90 days. That's what the legislation says. So you can't, it wouldn't really make sense to just model 0 or 90 or 45 days as somewhere in the middle. In fact, it's a distribution, and we have collected statistics to see, well, what does it actually look like, and we found that the mode is actually around 5 days. That's how long the production facilities usually stay closed because of environmental issues. But it could go up to 90 days, as the legislation prescribes. So it's the distribution with a long tail that goes on to up to 90 days. So there's that. Inspectors can literally close your plant, can close your operations, and then you lose revenue for the number of days that the plant was closed. And that is a very significant impact for any type of business. And then there are additional consequences in that business bucket is, for example, the court may prohibit any water discharge for the plant. And that means additional capex and additional opex going forward forever. And that also has to be accounted for when we're trying to calculate the risk. So what we've done is we've created a calculator in SIPMath, which is distributed for free from the probabilitymanagement.org. And if you haven't seen sessions by Sam Savage yet, make sure you tune into them. And if you want to learn about SIPMath and how to apply it and how to make any Excel file stochastic, how to make any Excel file capable of running Monte Carlo simulation on your phone or tablet or computer, how to turn any stochastic model into a native Excel file that you can just send to other people and they'll be able to change the inputs and it automatically resimulates. Make sure you watch Sam Savage's sessions from Risk Awareness Week 2019 and Risk Awareness 2020. And to find that, just go 2019.riskawarenessweek.com and 2020.riskawarenessweek.com, because Sam did an amazing job, in kind of going through step by step on how to use SIPMath. But basically, it's this amazing software, and I'll show you a demonstration of the model a little bit later. But it's an absolutely amazing software that allows you to save Monte Carlo trials in native Excel, and then you just create it like a little calculator that allows you to resimulate. People plug in their concentrations for the different chemicals. They plug in the value of the cost of production stop for each day. They plug in the OPEX and the CAPEX estimates, again, all those ranges, and then it just automatically resimulates. So this is an example of what we've done. Is there are different types of legislative impacts. So we searched for internal statistics, statistics published by government agencies, court data on different cases that involved fines from environmental agency to different corporations in the region and in the broader country, consequences, and we've a holistic stochastic decision tree. So that gives us a distribution, and that gives us a distribution, basically a risk profile. And what's interesting, it gives us a risk profile for each particular location of where the water is discharged into a river or a lake, and we can add those together to calculate the overall risk exposure for the plant, and we can add those together to calculate the overall exposure for the organization as the whole. So the first benefit of creating this simple calculator for our environmental teams was that we can now compare different plants one to another in terms of their environmental risks. Separate calculations for water pollution, separate calculations for air pollution, separate calculations for hard waste. Because even though the trees, stochastic trees, look similar, the methodologies for calculating the consequences are different, and they're legislated by different pieces of law. And so benefit number one, we can now compare different plants in terms of their risk exposure. But that's only half of the story. And yes, of course, we can calculate VAR 95% to compare that with other risks within the business. But that's only part of the story. The much more important benefit is that we're now able to understand what does the risk profile looks like for a particular risk, environmental risk. And we know what is the kind of 95th worst percentile, 95th worst case scenario, what is the expected loss, what is your kind of median or average. By the way, because these stochastic decision tree has binary events which can either happen or not happen, we've empirically proved that it's actually more valuable to use expected shortfall and not evaluate risk metric, and to use median instead of average for communicating and comparing one risks to another. But so that's only part of the benefit. The second part of the benefit is once you have this risk profile, you know what the expected losses are, you know what the unexpected losses are, and you know what the tail looks like. What's these last 5%, the catastrophic 5%. And that information is actually invaluable to measure and test different hypotheses about mitigations. So previously, the conversation would go, we need to build a new water purification facility, and that costs $20 million. Is that enough? Is it too much? Is it expensive? How does that compare to our risk exposure, and how does that reduce our risk exposure? Well, now you can answer all of those questions by plugging in different scenarios into the calculator. You know what your original current risk exposure is, and you can see how that risk exposure shrinks depending on different mitigation measures that you're using. And that graph in the bottom right is an example on how the company was deciding to choose different chemicals to improve the water quality from the business cycle, from the production cycle. And you could see how the risk exposure is changing. And the graph on the top that shows basically 4 different plants within the business, and you can see that A and B have a significantly higher risk exposure than D, for example. And that's where the mitigation focus should be. That's where the budget should go to in the first place. So those very powerful messages came from a pretty basic calculator online. Sorry, it wasn't online. It was just a normal native Excel stochastic calculator. So let me now switch and show you some of the features and just show you how quickly it recalculates 5,000 scenarios, because we've developed it in the SIPMath. So we've jumped into our Excel calculator, and I apologize for all non-Russian speaking viewers because I obviously didn't bother translating the calculator for the purposes of this presentation, but I will demonstrate the logic. And I think, or at least I will do my best to make this understandable for everyone. And so the purpose of the calculator, the idea of the calculator, remember, is a stochastic decision tree. So there are a number of possible consequences, and each consequence has a range of possible outcomes. And what we've done is we've tried to translate. First, we drew a tree on a piece of paper. Then we mind mapped it, but then we tried to translate that tree into an Excel model. So yellow fields are everything that the environmental team needs to fill in. And the first thing that they need to fill in is they need to fill in the chemicals and the different substances that are present in water and in water discharged from the plants. And remember, we're talking about an example of water pollution. We have exactly the same calculators, I mean, in terms of the mechanics, but the logic is very different for air pollution and hard waste. This one is for water pollution. So first is a set of chemicals that have concentrations, and they don't have just one concentration. That concentration actually fluctuates, it's volatile, and so it has a minimum, mode, and maximum. So what does that give you? That gives you your standard beta distribution, where you actually estimate the nature of that concentration for each specific chemical. And then there are additional uncertainties. Let me scroll to it. Additional uncertainties for each chemical, because the formula prescribed by the Ministry of Environment changes depending on whether the concentration is below or above a threshold for a specific chemical. So there is some more uncertainty here, depending on whether the concentration that a random simulation picks up in a particular trial, whether that concentration is below or above, the coefficient will change. The next item that we simulate is the volume, how much water, because it's not just the concentration per milligrams per liter. The other big uncertainty is, well, how many liters will the plant discharge during a particular day. So again, we have historical minimum, we have historical maximum, and we have some sort of mode that we used from historical observation. So we estimate that as well. Now, going further, we have some additional risks. Is one of the uncertainties, according to the government formula for calculating the consequences of a water pollution risk, is will the company be fined for, actually, let me make this holistic. There's one scenario where the company will not be fined at all. The company may be fined for the damage that it produced over the 3 days. The company may be fined over the damage for the damage it produced over 2 weeks, a month, a year, or 3 years. And the legislation kind of prescribes there's that optionality that the company may be fined for those different length of time. And obviously, the longer the time frame for the fine accumulates, the bigger the fine. And we're talking about a couple of hundreds of dollars to millions of dollars in fines. So that's quite a big difference. Another uncertainty that we have is if there's a scenario that the government prohibits any future discharge of water from that specific location, and we estimate the probability for that sometimes through calibrated experts. By the way, if you want to learn about how to calibrate experts, make sure you watch 2 sessions by Doug Hubbard and Graham Keith during this Risk Awareness Week, because they will dwell, is that the right word? I think I was meant to say they will dig deep and kind of dive into the topic of calibrating experts and getting their perception of probabilities and their estimates of consequences much more accurately than experts would do otherwise. And we have some estimates on the potential CapEx and OpEx that will be required to be spent by the company should this scenario occurs. By the way, this is why we use expected shortfall and not evaluate risk, because once you start bringing in those discrete scenarios into the calculation, the VAR kind of stops being representative and becomes quite quite deceptive. So, and there are a few other things, but basically the basic idea is that we have mapped out this equation that the government prescribes in the legislation, and we've added all those other branches. There's basically like a little field input for each branch of the tree, and you can see that this is for the first location, second location, same logic, third location, and so on. All of that is then simulated using SIPMath, and you can see the logo from probabilitymanagement.org. Make sure you check out the free software that they're offering, because it adds this amazing Monte-Carlo functionality to your native Excel. And make sure you tune in on Friday to watch my session with Sam Savage to talk about the next generation of tools of SIPMath that they're working on right now that will go live soon, and we call it Chancification Goes Live. It's going to be an amazing session because we had little conversations about it, and this is truly the future of quantitative risk analysis. So this is where all of the Monte Carlo trials are stored, and I can change some of the inputs, and it will recalculate the whole model there, and will recalculate VAR. And so what it looks at the end, we have this VAR, although in the later versions, I'm using an older version, in the later versions we did switch to expected shortfall because VAR wasn't representative enough. It gives you the histogram, the cumulative distribution. I've deleted a lot of sensitive data from this field so you can't see, but this would show you the actual box plots for different locations, and you can see the expected value and the conservative kind of expected shortfall for each of the locations within the plant, and then the summary for the plant, which I think is pretty exciting, because it takes a little bit of effort to create those models, but then you distribute them, and it just becomes a native Excel file, and anyone, anywhere can plug in the concentrations, change the OPEX and CAPEX estimates, change the cost of 1 day production hold, and it just automatically recalculates, because all of the probabilities have already been incorporated, and the environmental team has a lot less effort required to calculate the true risk exposure and then measure how different mitigation measures will work. For example, some mitigations may reduce the concentrations, and you can change the numbers here. You can see the effect. Some mitigations will reduce the volume, and you can change the numbers, and that will you can see here. Some mitigations may change the OPEX requirements, and again, you will be able to see that effect, which I think is absolutely amazing. And do ask questions, share your thoughts, maybe share an example of the calculators that you've done, stochastic calculators that you distributed to other parts of the business, and I'm sure everybody on the workshop would be interested in learning and sharing that experience with you.